Hello friends, I'm Chromatic Sauce, and today I'm going to be drawing with supplies from my March 2021 Sketchbox. Now, if you saw my last video, I drew some radishes with supplies when I unboxed them, but I felt like they gave us a lot of purples and I didn't use any in that drawing, so I really wanted to give those purples a shot in this drawing, and they really inspired me to draw some grapes. I thought it would go very cute with the radishes. So you see me here first sketching out the shape of the leaves. Now for this I took two images and just composited them together to make a nice cohesive composition. I really liked the look of the leaves in this photo, but I wanted the grapes to be a lot more drapey, so I used different grapes basically for the part that I was going to add for my drawing. Now if you look at the iPad, I also was going to add a hand. I figured since I had some browns, maybe I could add a hand, but I did get scared of my ability to draw skin tones, especially with markers. I'm not that used to drawing skin tones currently, so I just got rid of the hand. So once I had my general layout and shape of all of my leaves and the grapes, that's when I went in to make my sketches a little bit darker. I wanted to solidify the shapes of the grapes and the leaves a little bit more. Now, in my opinion, grape leaves are very pretty. They're very unique. They are kind of flippy. They have a lot going on. They have a lot of different shapes in just one leaf. I like the really spiky edges that are always really hard for me to draw for some reason. And they just flip around a lot. I like the shapes that they make. And I was a little bit worried with the green color I had since I only had one green, but I decided that it really needed a lot of leaves to make everything come together. It couldn't just be purple grapes. So when you're drawing with pencil, you want to make sure that you're not pressing too hard on the paper. You want to make sure your sketches are visible and stand out from your initial lighter sketches, but you also don't want to press so hard that you're marring up the paper. You don't want dents in the paper. You don't want to press hard enough that the graphite is sort of staining the paper. You want to be able to easily erase these lines. Another thing, when you're starting the sketches, you don't want to be afraid to erase if you mess up. If you saw on that top left leaf there, I erased the top of that so many times just because the dimensions were off. It looked off. If you're drawing something and something looks off, don't be afraid to erase it, because even if you worked an hour on one thing, if it looks bad, your drawing's going to end up looking bad no matter how hard you work on it. So I'd say, especially with the supplies they gave us in this box, since they're markers, they're very permanent, especially on paper. You're not going to be able to layer over a different color and then your mistake will go away. You want to make all your mistakes with the pencil, and you want to make sure that your final line is the actual final shapes that you want your drawing to be, because once you put that marker down, there's no going back. So basically, if you're using a mechanical pencil, be careful that the sharp tip won't scratch your paper. Be careful that you're not pressing too hard. Make sure you're really taking your time to find your outlines, and if you mess up, don't be afraid to erase. I really like the kneaded eraser for this because you don't have to wipe away any shavings. It just picks up the graphite, and it doesn't leave you with any smears or smudging, and it's really nice for a base drawing to have that kneaded eraser to just pick up anything that's a little bit off. And for these foreground grapes, I wanted them to look pretty realistic. I didn't want to just look like a bunch of circles. I wanted the layering of the grapes to look realistic. So I tried to go with the shapes of the actual grapes in the photograph to try to make sure the layering of the grapes looked good and that the dimension would all sort of be there. For these background grapes, I kind of just made them up. I figured since they were going to be in the background, they would be a little bit more blurry. They wouldn't be as highlighted. They would just literally be a background to push the grapes in the foreground forward. So I knew that they wouldn't matter so much. So I just made up those circles for myself. Then that's when I started to go in with the markers. Now I started with this wine color to do the darker outlines on the bottom left of the grapes. I sort of was going away from the picture a little bit. I wanted to just have a little bit more fun with it. I didn't want it to be so exact. So I just decided to get my outline down on everything before I started with the rest of the colors. That way I could erase all the pencils. Because when you're drawing with markers, if you put a marker over top of a pencil, it will usually permanently ingrain the pencil into the paper for some reason. So once I was done with those bottom grapes that I knew I wanted to be darker, the grapes in the background, which were going to be lighter, I went in with that mid-tone mallow shade from the Copic markers. And I did the same thing with those background markers, just with this lighter purpley color. And I just did an outline. Now for these ones, since this purple color is a lot lighter than that wine color from earlier, I did erase those grapes a little bit so that the graphite wasn't so dark. Now I knew these grapes weren't going to be all the way to a really, really dark purple, so I didn't want to leave any graphite to be showing through the marker. Once I was done that, I took the green marker from the little pack that they gave us, and I outlined all of the leaves. Now I knew this was my only green marker, so I figured since I was going to outline it in all brown anyway, I would just go ahead and outline all of the shapes with this green. That way I could go ahead and erase all of my pencil markings before I went in with the rest of the markers. Once I was done with all my outlines, I knew I wanted to start just shading right away. So I started shading with the lilac, then I realized I didn't erase my pencils yet. So I went ahead with the kneaded eraser and I erased all the markings. That way my paper would be nice and clean and ready for marker. Then I used the lilac shade to fill in everything. Now those background grapes, I knew I wanted them to stay lighter, so I just went over everything willy-nilly. I didn't bother about leaving any highlights or anything since they were in the background, they're not in focus. I figured the blurriness would include no highlight. Then going towards the bottom grapes, the foreground, I wanted to make sure I left white in these, so I used the lilac to do the upper side of the outline to give the top of the grapes definition, since the white highlight would be a little bit more of my perspective, just a little bit towards the top. So I wanted to give the grapes a little bit of a top outline with a lighter color just to contain the shape of the grapes. Then I went in with that mallow shade again to shade the underside of these grapes. Now I just did a little swoop underneath each of them. You see I'm not using a reference here. You don't see my iPad anymore. I'm just shading generally. I just wanted to get the color down, and I was really having fun with this one. It was fun to just throw color onto the paper, and the main thing I was worried about was just leaving those white highlights. Once I was done getting the mallow shade on top of everything, that's when I went in with the really dark purple shade from the kit that was made specifically for Sketchbox. And basically I went over all of that initial brown. I put that brown there because I knew it would give it a little bit more depth with this purple, even though this purple is pretty dark on its own. I just felt comfortable with that brown there, but I did cover everything with this purple. I didn't leave the brown showing at all, but I really think that wine brown color really helped give a little bit more dimension to the purple. So this is the part where the sketch probably would have helped me because I accidentally filled in an entire line of grapes to the left with that really dark purple. So I just have a really dark section of grapes to the left there. So I'm a little bit bummed about that, but I feel like that's the worst part of the whole drawing. So it's not too bad. If I really wanted, I could crop it, but I do like that leaf, so I think I'll keep it. And basically I used this dark purple as the darkest color in the whole image. And I wanted to make sure there was a really nice contrast with everything, so I added a lot of this really dark purple to just outline everything. And then along with that, I did want to outline everything. I wanted it to be a little bit more illustrative instead of like a realistic drawing. So I just gave everything an outline. I think outlines are just really fun. I don't know why. So I outlined every grape, even on the highlighted side, but I didn't cover that lilac shade. I did make sure it was just the thinner line on the top part of the grape and then a thicker line on the bottom for that little dropped shadow. Once I was done with that section, I decided to move on to the leaves. Now, the leaves were the part that I was most nervous for, since I, again, just like the radishes, I only had this green marker. But in this case, unlike the radishes, my clear blender marker was actually drying up. Now I think using this mixed media paper wasn't the best for this colorless blender because it sucked a lot of the juice out of the marker, so my blender was a little bit dry, so I wanted to try to make sure this green was down in a lot more even strokes because I wouldn't be able to go over it with the blender as much as I had it in the radish drawing. So I just tried to fill it in as well as I could all the time, hoping that the green wouldn't run out, because that would just be a disaster. If I ran out of the green, I would have had to find another marker to just fill in the rest of it. So I was just doing my best, and I just was the whole time thinking, how am I going to add dimension to these leaves? I do know from the radish drawing that the green doesn't layer on top of itself very great, like it doesn't get much darker when you just layer this marker on top of itself. It does get a little bit darker, but not really noticeable enough to give you the contrast that you need in a really nice drawing or illustration. So I just made sure I filled in everything, and I was gonna figure it out later. I figured maybe that walnut shade might be a good option. So I was thinking, since it was like more of a greenish kind of brown, I was hoping maybe I could shade with that. So after I'm going over everything with this colorless blender, I just did it for really small parts. Like I said, this blender marker was a little bit dried out, so I didn't have much to really just saturate the whole leaf. So I just went over all the really, really light spots from the photo. Now I'm looking at the reference for the leaves because I really wanted to make sure the leaves looked very dimensional and like actual grape leaves as much as possible. So I just shaded everything with this colorless blender to pick up the ink just like I did with the radishes, but only in sparing situations since I didn't have much juice in there. So you see me, I went over all the edges of them, and I went over the lines in the veins. That's when I picked up the walnut shade, and as soon as I put my marker on the paper, I regretted it because I just thought it looked terrible, the brown on top. In hindsight, I wish I put the brown before the green, that way the green could sort of layer on top of this walnut shade and blend it a little bit better into itself, but couldn't do anything about it now. I didn't want to go over with that really fine marker again, so I decided to just put the dark brown where the shading is and put it between the veins in the leaves to try to add a little bit of dimension and give it a little bit more shape to the leaves. Make the leaves a little bit more interesting than just a flat green. Now I'm glad I did this in the end because the radishes, I didn't want the leaves to look just like the leaves did on the radishes. I wanted them to look a little bit more cohesive with the grapes. So that's why I decided this lilac shade would be perfect because it is a really light color and I thought it would layer on top of the green really well. And I'm so happy I did it because it helped blend the walnut shade with the green shade perfectly, I think. It helped deepen up some of those back shadow areas. If you look at that bottom leaf, there's an overhanging part that I left really green with just a little bit of lilac, and then that under part with the brown where I put the lilac on top. It really made the dimension in the leaves pop out so much more, and I'm so glad I did that. And I think it helped make that walnut more cohesive with the whole drawing. Adding the purple to the leaves made the whole drawing really purpley, and it made the color scheme very cohesive in the end, and I'm really happy with the way it eventually turned out. Once I was done with the shading on the leaves, I thought the composition was missing something. The grapes were a little bit too separate. There was a little bit too much white in the image, so that's when I decided I would add this more of a drapey feature in this background grapes. The whole point of the grapes in the background was to push the foreground grapes more forward to help them stand out a little bit more. So I just added a bunch of more random circles back there and shaded them just like I did earlier, and I really think that helped the composition stand out a lot more. I liked the addition of a lot more purple and a lot of that lighter purple because I felt like the purple in the foreground was really dark. So I'm really glad I added those drapier grapes there. Once I was done with that section, I decided to go ahead and outline the leaves before I finished up the rest of the grapes. And I just used that really dark brown that came in that kit made for the Sketchbox. And I just outlined everything with the brown, And I also used the brown to add a little bit more accent marks in some of the leaves to give a little bit more dimension in some of the sections. And I really just liked the outlines. I think it helped everything come together, make the leaves look more like an actual object instead of just smears of color on the paper. I don't know. Does anyone else just really like outlines for some things, especially marker drawings like this? It really helps it pop out as an illustration, especially when it's not a really realistic drawing. So once I finished that outline, that's when I was gonna finish up the grapes. I thought the grapes were sort of missing something. They looked a little bit gray to me. Purple can kind of go a little gray. They looked a little muted. So again, I just love this pink color. I don't know what it is. It's just so bright and fun, and it does dry a little bit purple. So I did a little swoop of pink on every single of the foreground grapes, and I went over all of them with that mallow color just to sort of blend it out. I didn't want just to have bright pink on each of my grapes. They're grapes, they're supposed to be purple. So I went over it, and I think the dimension of that bright pink behind really helped it be punchier. And then I thought I was done after blending, but little did I realize the grapes were very white. I didn't like how white they looked. I thought they looked way too washed out. They didn't look purple enough. So I decided the next day that I would go back in with the lilac. I didn't want to make the grapes too dark. I wanted them to keep their highlights. So I just went around and around with the lilac. I brought the mallow in a little bit more, and I just made that white a lot smaller on each of them. On a lot of the grapes, I also took away some of the highlight. I didn't want to take away too much of the highlight. I was scared to make it too dark, but I wanted to give a little bit more dimension than just every single grape having a bright white highlight. So some of them I went over completely with the highlight. I went over it with the lilac. Some of them I went over completely with the mallow color. I didn't do too much else with that really dark purple. In the end, I was really glad I went back into this and I didn't leave so much white there. I was glad to shade them a little bit more, get rid of some of them white highlights, and really add a lot more dimension to the drawing by pushing back some of the grapes and bringing some a little bit more to the foreground, even in these front bushels. I even went in a little bit with the wine to deepen up some of them edges on the bottom corners of this. And I really love how this drawing turned out. Let me know what you think of this drawing down below. Let me know, did you like this month's Sketchbox? I sure did. It really helped me learn how to draw with markers a little bit more. Please like and subscribe, hit that bell, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!